This line is the 2007 minimum, and this is this year. Here we are right down here. So things are really changing very, very rapidly in the Arctic. So what does that mean? Well, there are lots of creatures in the Arctic, as in the Antarctic, that rely on sea ice for basic functions. Polar cod, seals, walrus that Caleb just talked about, as well as polar bears. These creatures' life cycles are intricately tied to the ebb and flow annually of sea ice. And when that sea ice changes, when that ebb and flow changes, it can pull trophic relationships that have developed over millennia apart. And many of these creatures face a very uncertain future. In addition, on top of the stresses already on these creatures as a result of climate change and the loss of sea ice, is the new industrial activity that has been made possible by the loss of ice, which used to protect the Arctic really as a wildlife and marine area of unparalleled diversity. So fishing is the first potential impact. Many of the world's most productive and commercially valuable fish populations occur in the subarctic. And there is an expectation that as the water warms, there will be a migration of fish northward into the Arctic. And where fish go, fishermen, we have learned, usually follow. And our record of fisheries management around the world is not particularly inspiring of confidence. These are just graphs of a few fisheries I pulled out, bluefin, etc. 2/3 of the world's fish stocks are now considered to be overfished or depleted or fully exploited. And many are really in serious trouble. So our record is not great on fisheries. And even more troubling, there is no mechanism right now, international mechanism in place to regulate new fishing in the Arctic. And our experience has been that it's really important to get out in front of fisheries and get precautionary measures in place before the fisheries start. But so far, we've had very little movement in that direction, as Dave Vandersweg pointed out. Shipping that Caleb talked about very, very extensively is another issue. As he said, these are some of the shipping routes that he articulated. In addition to shipping routes, there are oil and gas deposits throughout the Arctic. That's these gray areas. The Arctic is projected to contain about up to a quarter of the world's remaining undiscovered oil and gas. And of that, of the oil component of it, 84% is anticipated to lie offshore. So you've got huge offshore oil reserves in addition to shipping going on. The problems related to both shipping and oil and gas development in the Arctic are quite substantial. There are many hours and days and months of fog. There's darkness 6 months out of the year. There are howling winds, the raging sea ice storms, heaving ice and movement all the time. This is a hugely challenging environment to work in. And in addition, as Caleb and David pointed out, there aren't a lot of ports and other facilities that are up there that could support accident response. A colleague of mine likes to talk about the accident in the Gulf of Mexico that we had a year and a half ago as akin to having a heart attack in the lobby of a major New York hospital. The response capability doesn't get any better than it is in the Gulf of Mexico. That's where the headquarters of everything is in the oil industry, and they are massively prepared for a spill, and yet we still weren't able to deal with it effectively. In the Arctic, a spill would be like having a heart attack in the middle of the Gobi Desert. Good luck. So there is, similar to fishing, there is no international control over offshore oil and gas development. As David Vandersweg pointed out, there is under negotiation a spill response agreement, but the agreement does not deal with prevention, which in the Arctic is the absolute #1 strategy. And furthermore, the current draft of the agreement right now contains a lot of very nice hortatory language and very few concrete requirements, other than requirements on naming who to contact if there's a spill. So it's basically like an organizational chart required, and that's it. So the response that the governments have had to this challenge in the region is really not quite up to where it needs to be in a variety of mechanisms. And the one other thing I wanted to add about the Polar Code, and others who are in the room are probably much more familiar with this than I am, but my understanding is that Polar Code has been sort of stalled for quite a long time, and people do not anticipate much in the way of further development in the very near future. So, where do we go from here? Scientists tell us that perhaps the most important thing we can do to protect and enhance resilience of natural ecosystems and of the wildlife that lives in the Arctic is to establish protected areas throughout the Arctic and to manage new human activities on an ecosystem-based way. And there's really some good news here and progress being made that I want to share, because otherwise it's very depressing. The first is that a number of efforts to identify critically important areas have been underway now for several years. This happens to be the map of one of those efforts that NRDC and IUCN undertook together with the generous support of the Prince Albert Foundation. And you can see one of the areas up here is the Bering Strait. And the scientists who attended this workshop to help us identify the most important areas to protect in the Arctic identified the Bering Strait as the single most important area in the Arctic in terms of wildlife and biological diversity. So this is just one of several different efforts that have come up since this time. And I think there is very important progress being made within the Arctic Council and within individual states to begin to identify the areas that need protection, which is a very important first step. So, for example, Canada has done a map of its ecologically and biologically sensitive areas that they showed to us just this past spring. The United States has recently launched in July a process to identify key areas off the Arctic coast. And perhaps most significantly, the Swedes put on the table last week a proposal to convene a workshop to bring all these different efforts to identify EBSAs together as part of a first step towards creating a network of protected areas in the Arctic. This would be a huge, huge step forward. So there is reason for optimism, and we definitely are seeing progress in that realm. David van der Zwag mentioned the high seas. Many people have said, well, why do we have to deal with the high seas of the Arctic Ocean? Nobody's ever going to go there. There's still ice there. You know, why bother even thinking about this area? Well, as you can see, this is the 2007 limit of the low sea ice in the summer. This boundary is the boundary of international waters. The limit of sea ice is now significantly less right now as we speak. It comes up this way and around this way. So an increasing percentage of the high seas is now open water and is now available to shipping, fishing, etc. So we are very concerned about what happens out here because nobody really understands what's up there. It's been covered in ice for millennia. Scientists can only go there in the summer. Very few of them have been under the ice to inventory any of the biology or really anything else under that ice. So we know that it's an area of very low productivity. We know that it's extremely vulnerable as a result, but we don't know what else might be risked. So one of the key things that we and others have proposed is a moratorium on extractive activities in this area until we have a better understanding of on what lies there and what the resources are that could be in need of protection. So, with that, what's wrong with this picture? Is everybody awake? All right. We're going to transfer over to the Antarctic.
Thank you. So we have a few minutes if anybody's got some questions for the first group of Arctic speakers before we transition. And if you want to direct your question to one of the speakers, that's perfectly okay. First question there. There's microphones on the corridor, so to speak, in the middle.
Thank you. My name is Hendrik Segers from the Belgian Biodiversity Platform, and I have a question for Professor Van der Zwaag, if I pronounce that correctly. As I'm sure you know, the substaff, the CBD substaff, in its meeting of November last year, dealt with draft recommendations on Arctic biodiversity. And these recommendations will be dealt with now in November in Hyderabad during a conference of the parties. So the CBD is working on Arctic biodiversity, and also there's a lot of work going on in CBD on biodiversity in marine regions beyond national jurisdiction. How do you see the role of CBD in the governance of that region?
David, you want to come up here?
Yeah. Yeah, because of time, I wasn't able to get into all the details of multilateral governance, and CBD obviously is very relevant in establishing criteria for identifying ecologically or biologically significant areas. Again, they had a workshop, for example, as you know, with OSPAR, Northeast Atlantic Fishery Commission, where in fact they did identify as one of the biologically, ecologically significant areas the whole area of high seas beyond national jurisdiction under NEAF's jurisdiction. Again, there wasn't any specific recommendation to move forward on protecting. It was just more of identification. So that's another issue, moving forward on what you identify. Are you going to actually protect it, and then how you protect it? So again, all I would say is we have very fragmented international regulation in a way. You have the CBD. Again, they're trying to address, in some ways, aspects of climate change. We live in a very fragmented world. And I think one of our big challenges is to really have integration. And again, some would say that's maybe why we need at some point some kind of integrated process for dealing with the high seas of the Arctic as well.
Another question? Please identify yourself.
Keith Alverson, I'm Director of Climate Change Adaptation at UNEP. Both speakers talked about a lack of governance in terms of fisheries and oil extraction in the high seas of the Arctic. I wonder if you could comment on the relevance of the UN Law of the Sea, and then also perhaps comment on, in both diagrams of the exclusive economic zones, there was no effort to show the relatively new claims by countries such as Russia, which reach all the way to the pole.
Which of our speakers would like to deal with that?
Well, the Law of the Sea Convention basically provides basic obligations for all states to kind of manage efforts on areas beyond national jurisdiction. So you have every country has a freedom to fish up there, freedom to navigate, freedom to read scientific research. I think the difficulty of the Law of the Sea Convention is a framework convention, so it has minimal responsibilities, very general responsibilities. For example, environmental impact assessments for major activities like mining that may have a significant impact. There's an obligation, but again, it's a very general obligation without really details of the process. It leaves a lot of discretion to states, and this is a concern to a lot of people, to what extent we'll have consistency, what happens with environmental impact assessments in the future, for example. In terms of the extended continental shelf jurisdiction, we didn't get into that, but I mean, there's Article 76 of the Law of the Sea Convention, gives every Arctic coastal state the right to try to extend beyond 200 nautical miles its deep seabed, its continental shelf, where it extends further. And again, you have a commission on the limits of the continental shelf where it has to validate essentially those claims. So that's a process ongoing right now. U.S., for example, not being a party to the Law of the Sea Convention, another interesting twist, how they legitimize their claim eventually unless they become parties. So again, one would hope to see the U.S. become a party in due course after this election, and we'll see where that goes.
Just to clarify, there are two different
there are two different regimes that apply. The seabed is subject to this claims process. And David, I thought, had a map up there of the seabed claims. The water column is not subject to that. And the high seas of the water column will not be claimed by any country. That is international waters and subject to freedom of the seas, as David said.
We got time for one more question. Scott?
Scott Hayes, based on board. And David, just to continue this line of questioning, what role do you envision for the International Seabed Authority in those areas beyond claims for continental shelf that are truly under the remit of the International Seabed Authority?
That's a very good question, and I don't think the International Seabed Authority necessarily has an answer to that either at this point. I mean, obviously it has the licensing powers generally wherever it is in the deep sea bed of the world. They'll be the one that licenses eventually. But again, this is an issue where I think the Arctic states really have to step up soon to begin some kind of the international discussion. Do we want seabed mining in the future? It may not be to the advantage of the coastal states with the risks that come with it. But again, there's been very little dialogue that's occurred to date yet on this issue. So there really are some basic policy discussions that are needed about the future of the high seas. Do we want to commercialize it, conserve it, a mix, sustainable use? We need these policy dialogues to occur. And again, it could occur in different ways, partly perhaps through the Arctic Council, other forums. We were talking this morning, maybe there's a need for a polar forum, begin discussions across the poles and try to transfer experiences. Again, you have the deep sea bed mining issues looming in the Antarctic as well, correct? Where again, states have laid back pushing that issue. Australia said, well, here's our information. We don't want the limits on the continental shelf commission to deal with that right now. But they gave notice that there may be some kind of future claims. So these are interesting things that we perhaps need more international exchanges of experiences on as well.
Okay, now we're going to turn the earth over for the next segment. Our first speaker is Claire Christian. Claire is the director of the ASOC Secretariat in D.C. She plays a key role in the International Marine Reserves and MPA campaign led by the Antarctic Ocean Alliance, of which ASOC is a key member. She's been to a number of Antarctic Treaty and CAMLAR meetings, and is an expert, I might add, on the Marine Stewardship Council, for those of you who care about that organization, having worked on our 2 appeals on Antarctic krill and Ross Sea toothfish. Claire? Dorothy? You got it?
She can do it. I think. So Dorothy's going to talk a little bit about the process that's underway at the Commission on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, which is sort of undertaking this multi-year effort to designate a series or a network of MPAs and marine reserves in the Southern Ocean. But I'm going to talk a little bit about how that fits into ecosystem-based management, which is how the Southern Ocean is managed by CAMLAR, and just basically introduce you to some of the challenges and some of what we're trying to accomplish with the network of marine protected areas. Because Antarctica doesn't have a permanent human population, obviously the challenges and the issues are a little different when you talk about MPAs. There's no runoff from agriculture, there's no mining, there's no widespread pollution, but the main sort of human impact there is harvesting of marine living resources. And that interest is growing in fishing for krill and for toothfish. And in the case of krill, this is the base of the Antarctic food web. There's, a huge range of animals are dependent on krill, from fish to penguins to whales and seals. And at the same time, even though there is a lot of krill fishing typically targets the same areas where these animals are eating. So there's huge potential for conflict. And in the case of toothfish, toothfish is a large top fish predator, and it's long-lived and slow-growing, so it's vulnerable to overexploitation. And also, I should say, Antarctic toothfish is known by Chilean sea bass, and you might remember from a few years ago, there was a huge a huge problem when people discovered these populations of Antarctic and Patagonian toothfish and started fishing them a little bit faster than they could handle. And in terms of other ecosystem impacts, krill fishing gear doesn't have much impact on the ecosystem, but toothfish longlines have been known to have impacts on the benthic communities, many of which are poorly studied and poorly understood. So there's a risk, especially with, polar organisms tend to be more vulnerable to disturbance. So there's a risk that we could be impacting these communities before we even know what they are. And another major challenge, obviously, climate change is affecting parts of the Antarctic, particularly the West Antarctic region. And this has to be taken into account by CAMLR and is hopefully going to be taken into account in the system of marine protected areas so that we can manage Antarctic marine ecosystems effectively. So on the screen, as Jim mentioned, there's the Antarctic Ocean Alliance, which is heavily involved in developing this, well, we're not developing the system ourselves, but we're trying to have our input into the process. And here are some 19 areas where we've suggested that MPAs could go in the Antarctic. And these, I just want to point out, these are not the boundaries we've suggested. These are just ecological regions that we think have characteristics that are worth protecting in this network. And we've been working on this for about a year, and Antarctic Ocean Alliance is a coalition of a huge number of organizations. So the first area I'd like to mention is the Antarctic Peninsula, which is one